our spooky season panel. This is the ins and outs of writing horror. I'm going to turn it over very quickly to your moderator, Daniel Mills.
Alrighty, well, thank you everyone for coming. My name is Daniel Mills. I'm the author of 2 novels and 2 collections of short stories. And in the words of the great American horror writer Thomas Ligotti, I have always been afraid. And it isn't just me either. The first extant depiction of a ghost is thought to be 3,500 years old, scratched into wet clay by a Mesopotamian scribe, hardened into stone by fire or time, while the earliest haunted house tale in the Western tradition dates as far back as the Roman Empire. These days we tend to call these stories folk tales, urban legends, horror fiction, or scary stories best told in the dark. But I would argue the purpose of these stories isn't primarily frightening. Now, of course the term horror will have a different meaning to every writer who works in the field. Some like it, others don't. But more and more, personally, I find I'm drawn to the term the literature of the uncanny, as it suggests to me a vast body of work transgressing all tropes and genre boundaries, encompassing not only stories of the supernatural or the fantastic, but stories that explore physical and spiritual trauma, grief, mental illness, and existential despair. Because life is terrifying. Reality is frequently horrific and often cruel. The world itself transforms the literature of the uncanny into a kind of elevated realism, awful to behold, a glass darkly, reflecting our present moment of slow motion apocalypse. Horror stories speak to the darkest aspects of our world and of ourselves, as if to allow us a measure of understanding, perhaps, or merely the illusion of control. And maybe that's comfort. I don't know. Luckily for me, however, and more importantly for you, I don't need to figure it out all by myself. I'm joined today by the authors Kristin Dearborn, Margot Harrison, and Brian Staveley, who are going to take turns introducing themselves and their work. We'll start with you, Brian.
Hi, my name is Brian Staveley. I'm not a horror writer. I write adult fantasy. I've written 5 novels, but my books do include elements of the scary and supernatural, so hopefully I'll fit in a little bit of it.
Hi, I'm Margot Harrison. I have written 4 YA thrillers and my adult debut, The Midnight Club. I would say, I'm not sure if I would consider myself a horror writer, but everything that I write is definitely at least horror adjacent. It's definitely creepy, scary, spooky. So I'm happy to talk about this topic.
My name is Kristin Dearborn. I am a proud horror writer. I wear the badge. I got the horror writing tattoo. I love horror. I studied horror in my undergraduate at the University of Maine. In grad school, I studied horror fiction and have been writing for about 10 years now. My latest novel is a skunk apes and suicide cult story set in Florida called Faith at Dawn, and I recently appeared in the anthology The Rack with some of the biggest upcoming names in horror. This is fantastic reading if you can get a copy of that.
Well, thank you all. I really want this to be kind of an informal, unstructured discussion, so I'll start us off with kind of a question, but then I just feel free to jump in, because don't wait on me to call on you, right? So I think where I'll start is kind of where my own interest in horror started, which is not, I find, uncommon when I talk to other horror writers, and that's childhood. I think for many authors of horror, our first experiences of the genre happen when we're young. We become fascinated by it when we're younger, and then that carries with us for the rest of our lives. And so I thought I would ask the panel, looking at this, that for so many people, an interest in horror originates in childhood. Is there something about childhood in particular, powerlessness, helplessness? What is it about that experience that drives so many people to find, solace, distraction in the uncanny?
My parents were huge readers, and our house was full of books when I was a kid. Everything from I can remember reading Last of the Mohicans with my dad when I was very, very small, to my parents having an extensive Stephen King collection. I read Stephen King way younger than I should have, but I was also reading things like Bunnicula, the Vampire Rabbit book, which is like the reason that I am the way I am today. So I don't feel like it came from a place of fear, but it was something that was readily available, and I gravitated towards those books versus romance, mystery, or other genres.
I think for me it was kind of coming from a place of anxiety and feeling like the world was uncontrollable and inexplicable. I moved around when I was a kid from the country, the extreme rural country, to New York City and back, so it was a little bit confusing. And I think scary stories were one of the things that helped me, because when I was reading a scary story, I felt like my view of the world as not making sense was validated. So I read things like the old anthology Strangely Enough. I loved that, which was supposedly like all true. And then when I was 10, I remember passing a copy of Carrie back and forth with a friend. So it definitely does start early.
I mean, I'm the odd one out here because really horrifying stuff is too scary for me. I don't watch it, I don't read it. So I'm curious to throw it back at you two. Like, what do you get out of it? What are you seeking there? Because when I read something that's terrifying, I think, well, shit, I'm terrified now, and I can't sleep, and this is unpleasant. So, like, is it some kind of like notion of catharsis or recognition?
I think so. I mean, I feel like, because I feel like there are two different types of people. There are people whose anxiety is heightened by horror, and there are people whose anxiety is relieved by horror. And I'm definitely the latter. I don't know, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, in October, I had a goal to watch 31 horror movies. I only made it to 26. But it's like you turn on the news, and that's really scary, and it doesn't go away. If I am watching The Conjuring, there's an off button, and it's gone. It just
And it doesn't stay with you into the night or when you're camping or camping's a big one for me.
I've desensitized myself pretty well over the decades of being a horror fan. But I think camping is the scariest. That's the scariest scenario. Like tent scenes in horror books and horror movies, those get me.
Yeah.
They still do.
The backwoods creepy subreddit, if anyone's ever been there, really, really scary.
I mean, I'm curious to hear from you too, Daniel. I mean, it's also
what I can kind of speak to is, for me, I was just always fascinated by it. As far back as I can possibly remember. And I remember talking about this with one of my good friends who's known me since I was 3. And we're trying to hash this out and figure out where it started. And something that you mentioned that I had never really thought about was when I was a baby, I had a number of kind of life-saving surgeries that were done shortly after birth, but I had no memory of these things. I know they happened. I have the scars, and that's about all I know. But my friend asked, well, given the significant bodily trauma that you experienced at that early age, is there something that you carry with you from that experience? And I often think about that because when I was a kid, I would not have been able to articulate in any way why I was rereading, especially like the scary stories and Tell in the Dark books, which were so popular when I was younger. Like the illustrations, the stories themselves, they really did scare me. Like I don't know that I drew comfort from them. I think they scared me, but it was almost a compulsory kind of thing for me where I couldn't help but return to that place because it made me scared. Maybe it's like similar to Kristin, I know you mentioned the news today, there's this phenomenon of doom scrolling where you continue to dig deeper and deeper into things that you know are going to be upsetting, and yet sometimes we feel unable to stop. And that's kind of how I first came to horror, right? it scared me deeply and profoundly. So,
It becomes like a challenge that you give yourself. Yes, I can watch Friday the 13th,
Yes.
and I will not, need to creep into my mother's bed afterwards.
Is there a line for any of the three of you where, for me, there's a line where it goes from being horror and truly terrifying into being action, right? And usually that line is when I have some understanding of the threat. And for this reason, zombie movies don't strike me as horror, because I'm like, this is just a technical problem to be solved. It's a matter of doors, windows, food supply, clean water, right? And so for me, it can tick over, like Friday the 13th, not scary, it's just a guy, and you just gotta get away from him. But how do you all find that line? Or does that line exist for you?
Yeah, I mean, I find movies that are like slasher movies less scary.
Yeah.
Although I recently challenged myself to watch the first Terrifier, and that stuck with me a little bit, because when it gets gross enough, it does kind of, there's a residue afterwards, like that horror that sticks with you.
Yeah, I think going into experiencing horror books and movies, I approach them with a certain glee. So it takes a pretty special one to disturb me. The average one, like the Terrifier franchise, I've watched all three of them in October. Art the Clown is so fun. But it's you can just tell that the actor's having a good time, and it just seems fun. So it's hard to kind of separate that. Then on the flip side, one of the other movies I watched was the original Funny Games, which there's nothing fun or charming or whimsical about that, and it's kind of just agonizing watching people suffer for 2 hours. So that's the line that I see when I'm engaging with horror is I like the more campy side of things and the more whimsical side of things, like Terrifier, lighthearted splatterfests.
Yeah, maybe if I see the other two, I'll feel that way too. I'll get desensitized a little bit more.
I think what's really interesting about horror, as compared to other kind of genres of fiction is, if we think of genre as a kind of classification, it's usually based on the tropes that show up in the story at any given time. We have the tropes of horror, we have the haunted houses, we have monsters, all of these kinds of things. But you mentioned Funny Games, Kristin, and that's a movie that's very much about horror, why we watch horror movies, and don't know that it's really a horror film, and that the director Michael Haneke, his film Cachet is one that comes to my mind as something that deeply unnerved me, far more than a horror film would. And that's not something you find in the horror section of the video store. So I guess maybe what I'm trying to get at is, it's because the boundaries of the genre are so fluid. What are we talking about when we talk about, horror fiction, horror cinema? Are there things that to you really define our experience of the genre?
Well, you mentioned at the beginning a few things that I can't remember now, but a focus on the interiority of either the narrator or the protagonist seems crucial to me. Like I said, zombie movie is usually an external problem to solve, but the horror movies and books that really get to me are when it seems like the narrator's own psyche is crumbling under the weight of something, reality versus unreality, paranormal versus normal. And that's what I find so unsettling, because it's like, the danger is inside your own skull. And that's like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I feel like horror involves dealing with the unknown and possibly unknowable and chaotic, at least a little bit. And I feel like there is a strong vein of nihilism in horror, although there recently there's been this whole debate about whether cozy horror is a thing. Like, is Tim Burton cozy horror? Can horror be cozy? I'm not sure about that. I mean, I feel like John Beller's books maybe, or something like that would qualify, but to me, horror is not really cozy.
Yeah.
It's been said that horror is the only genre that's an emotion. Like, anything can make you feel horrified. Like, a bad relationship is horrifying in its own way. So really, anything, I'm of the opinion that anything can be horror. So sure, it can be cozy, it can be, I also like to advocate that, like, Jurassic Park is a horror movie. It's not science fiction, that's horror, because those dinosaurs are scary. So I think anything that elicits that fear or dread or anything like that, we can claim for horror.
I like what you were saying, Margot, about the unknown and the unexplained and how you engage with that. And something that I often come back to is, for so many horror authors, so many stories that strike me as really effective, there is something essentially unresolved within the text that isn't resolved by the end of the story. The great British horror author Robert Aickman is probably one of the best known practitioners of this particular kind of story, where there is some kind of unresolved anxiety that seeps into you as you read the story, and there's no outlet for it. You just carry it away with you after you finish the story. And when I think about the unknown and the unexplained, I find I often put this. I'm reminded of this idea of like mysterium tremenda, right? That we see the unknown, we approach the unexplained, and it causes us to feel terrified. But it also, could potentially cause us to feel awed. And there's beauty in the unexplained, and in the and in emotions that overwhelm our ability to articulate them. And so I would maybe love for you all to talk a little bit about, in your own experience writing, like, what is the place of beauty in a work of, of dark fiction? Is there a place for it?
Yeah, I think a lot about the place of the sublime. I mean, that's sort of where fear and beauty meet, at least in romanticism. In literary criticism, it's the sublime. And I'm trying to think of an example from what I've written, but I do, I always feel like if somebody says your book is beautiful and terrifying, then I've achieved what I set out to do. Like, that's how I feel about Ari Aster's movies, like Hereditary. Like, they're beautiful and they're horrific and terrifying. So that's kind of a combination that I strive for.
Is the xenomorph from Alien beautiful? Is the Thing beautiful as it's going through all of its transformations? I think some of Stephen King's descriptions of just people and how people exist could be described as that. But from my writing perspective, I don't go gunning for that.
I like that idea how, it's what you were getting at, Kristin, like our ideas of horror, or of beauty rather, are really culturally defined. And, so much of the tropes of the horror genre, that we have, that we love, are culturally kind of inculcated, which is why it can be such a revealing experience to go out and read horror literature in translation, or more commonly to watch horror cinema. Obviously, Japanese horror cinema has kind of had a moment, and I think we're getting there's more of an awareness now of things like the new French extremity, like all these sort of subgenres that I think are more prominent now than ever before. And it makes me wonder, is there horror that doesn't work for us as, readers who have a certain tradition, that we've encountered? Are there things that are too other for us to cause us to feel fear or to be awed by them? Can there be things that are just beyond, that are so far beyond our understanding that they no longer affect us emotionally in the way that we want art to do? I'm curious about what I'm trying to get at is there, what makes a work of horror literature fail, right? Can there be too much that's unknown within the text that we don't relate? Can it be too tropey that it just feels tiresome? What is it about a piece that might cause, a work of fiction, say, to fail in your eyes?
I feel like there's so many different perspectives. A little while ago, you were talking about things being unresolved, and that made me think of Paul Tremblay, who is like the current master of ambiguity in horror fiction. And I know a lot of people that doesn't work for them. They don't care for his writing because you don't know if the vampire is real or not, and you don't know what happens at the end of a horror movie. But then there's a ton of other people who think that he's one of the greatest writers working today because you don't know if it's a vampire or not. The same reasons make it succeed and fail. And then we were talking about Terrifier, and I think there are some people who would say, that's too campy, that's too... But then there's another entire audience who eats that up, and that's why they go to the movies to see that. So I can't think of anything that you can say that it's just unilaterally failed across the board. I think there's something for everyone.
I mean, one of the places where the rubber meets the road for me in my books here is in my most recent book. There's a whole continent that has been cursed for millennia, and everything there, every living thing there is horribly twisted. And I was like, oh, this is a great idea. And then I have to think of all the shit that lives there and is horribly twisted, and I have to make it scary and weird. And that was an interesting exercise because I kept thinking of things. I'd be like, that's just stupid. Like, this is just what? Like, it's like a bleeding penguin. Like, it's not cool. And so I'm trying to think, like, what's actually scary? And I think some of the stuff that ended up being scariest is not what I initially thought. Like, I have these birds, and the way their feathers are, they just are hanging in weird ways that looks like the feathers are dripping off them, which I don't think is actually, it's not like a monster, right? The birds aren't trying to get anybody. But I was more pleased with those birds in the end, these kind of rotting looking birds, than I was with some of the weird monsters that had teeth on their elbow, whatever it was that I was coming up with. And I have to come up with a lot of this shit. There's a whole continent. And, with various degrees of success. And so that was a situation where I kept thinking, like, does this succeed or fail? Is it horrifying or is it not horrifying? And I kept kind of being surprised after creating 100 different things, what things I thought, oh yeah, that is actually scary, or like, no, this is just stupid.
Yeah, it's a real challenge to come up with scary things.
Yeah.
And I tend to lean into the uncanny, like that subtle wrongness you were talking about. It tends to be, for me, it's scarier than something that is obviously like horrific. I feel like horror has become such a broad genre, at least in cinematically, definitely, and maybe in literature too, because it is like, it's cheap to produce in Hollywood anyway, and it tends to have a big reaction, and people will still go to the theater to see it. And because of that, you do have some horror movies, or like a lot of directors who would have been art directors in past decades are now making horror movies, like Osgood Perkins, who made Longlegs. I mean, his movies are really arty, and I like them, but I would not say that they're the most scary. So I can see why some horror fans are just not into that. And I have sometimes encountered that in books too, where I feel like this is kind of spooky and it's like really well written and literary, but I don't really find the horror here. Like, this is not scary to me.
Kind of in the flip side of the fear of the unknown, one of my favorite things and one of the things that I like to do in my fiction is set up a group of people, and there's a monster, there's a supernatural fangy thing, but really the interactions between the people are where the real horror happens, and things like domestic violence, things that are very, very real. That's scarier than the tentacle beast that's outside the window. And I think playing those things off each other is interesting. I wouldn't call it fun, but it's an interesting exploration.
Well, that comes back into the horror being interior to the humans, not extrinsic, right? The monster or whatever, the ghost, the vampire, is what kind of cracks open our humanity and lets some of the ugly stuff bleed out, right?
Right, because when people are in a survival situation, their worst sides usually do come out.
I mean, that's The Shining in a way, right?
I mean, it's 28 days later. It's most good classic, I would say.
Yeah.
So often the horror that we are encountering as readers or watching the movie is, it's the inner dark that people hold inside themselves, and that can be the thing that touches us, and follows us after we turn the movie off or put the book down, and it kind of makes me think about sort of we've talked a little bit about the slasher genre. We have this idea of genreification in literature, and horror is one particular thing. Crime fiction is a different thing. True crime is a different thing. Is there a way in which we should be looking at where what we think of as horror and what we think of as crime fiction or true crime writing intersect? And are there any great examples that you could point to?
I would say that Thomas Harris books, like The Silence of the Lambs, are kind of on the border between crime fiction and horror. I mean, technically, they present themselves as crime procedurals, but Hannibal Lecter is just like, I don't know, he's like a chaotic force that he really feels like a horror construction.
Mo Hader is another one. I believe she's a British author, and she wrote crime novels. I don't remember if there was anything supernatural in them or not, but they were brutal and absolutely horrific. So I think there's been a thought that if it's supernatural, it's horror. If it's not supernatural, it's thriller or crime. And back in the 80s, when the publishing houses were just trying to find the next Stephen King, they really oversaturated the horror market with just tons and tons of books. And I think in the 90s, there was a big pushback against the name horror, and things were called a thriller, or they were trying to come up with every name that they could. Bookstores got rid of their horror sections, and in the last decade and a half, I think we've seen horror coming back and reclaiming our place in speculative fiction.
Can I just ask the three of you, because I feel like I'm still hung up on the very beginning of the talk. Like, if you had to choose one thing from a book or a movie that you'd say, that horrifies me, like a specific moment, character, incident, question, is there anything? For me, it's that little girl from The Ring. Just because I'm like, I don't know how to handle her. She's like, nobody really seems to. And that's so scary because there's no procedure, there's no protocol, there's no understanding that you can't like lock the windows or anything. Do you have things where you say, that's horror for me?
Yeah, I mean, I feel similarly, like things that have no rules.
Yes,
like,
yes,
yeah.
I hate that shit.
Samaritan, The Ring is a good example, and
That's a
It
good way to put
Follows
it, yeah.
for me, like that's one of my
yeah.
favorites, where it's like this thing will come after you, and maybe it has rules, maybe it doesn't, we can't be sure, all we can do is experiment, and we probably can't ultimately keep it away.
Thinking about specific moments, you mentioned The Shining a while ago. I think the scariest scene in that book is when Jack brings the wasp nest into Danny's room, and it's dead, it's fine, don't worry about it. And then in the middle of the night, all the wasps come back to like that. I think that's the scariest part of that book.
What is it about that you find scary?
There shouldn't be wasps.
But it's a little bit tied maybe to the same thing. We're saying the inexplicable unrule-boundness of it. unrule boundaries.
Yeah,
This is one for you.
I'm trying to think of a literary example, like in Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, when something is suddenly like pounding against the door in the dead of night, like a really loud sound, and then you hear it down the corridor, and then it comes to the main character's room, and it's just pounding, and there's there's nothing that can make that sound. Like, you just know that there's something enormous out there, and you don't know what it is, and you're afraid to look, of course.
Finding my own reading experiences, it's oftentimes small details that it's almost difficult for me to put my finger on why they scare me, and maybe it's because it's difficult for me to identify, because there's something just a little bit off about them in the way that you mentioned. I don't, like Kristin, I think I'm largely desensitized by this point to like feeling anxious while reading or watching a horror movie. And so I'm trying to think back to those few times in the last 16 or 15 years when I felt that. And one that comes to mind is it's a fairly obscure short story from the late 19th century called The Villa Lucina by Ella Darcy, is the author's name, published in the Yellow Book, and the premier decadent publication of the Panelists. And it's an account of a visit to a house that a wealthy family is thinking of renting for the summer. And almost nothing happens in the story. They go through the different rooms. They all are kind of oppressed by this sense of unease that something's happened. There's some kind of prior tragedy hanging over the family that's hinted at incredibly subtly. But I think it's there enough that it affects you as a reader. It adds to this overall kind of saturation of mood that infects you as you read it, so that even the smallest details, and my recollection is it's the hem of a lacy dress stuck in a closed door, like has the ability to kind of unnerve you for being just out of place. The world of the story has been created with such skill that when something is out of place, it affects you as the reader in the way that if you were to encounter something in your real life, if I have not ever had any kind of supernatural experiences, but certainly many people have. And I think those are often small details. They're often little things that suggest so much more beyond themselves. And I find in fiction, for me, those are sometimes the most effective. And I go away haunted, even if I'm not quite sure why.
I'm curious on a craft question. I was reading a little bit before this, just kind of reading some of the books from folks here. And Daniel, there's a quote, I forget which book this is of yours, but you didn't say, your narrator said, it's describing a ghost story. A respectable narrator visits a country house where he experiences a series of unsettling incidents before the final appearance of the ghost bursts on his mind like a thunderclap. His faith is shattered, or his sanity. He is changed forever. And the thing that struck me about that is that I had just been reading a couple excerpts from Margot and Kristin, and both of you, at least in the excerpts I was reading, were writing in third person limited. I haven't read all of your works. Do you ever write in first person when you're writing horror? And how do you make that choice? Super curious to hear your thoughts on this.
I do. All my YA books are in first person.
I read the wrong excerpt.
Well, you read the most recent book, which is, this is my most horror book. It's called The Glare. It's about a deadly video game, and that is in first person. When I write in first person, I usually have an unreliable narrator. And I kind of lean on that a little bit. A narrator who is experiencing things that don't make sense, and she really doesn't know whether they're in her head or whether they actually exist. So I really lean on that when I use first person. With third person, I think I switched to third person with this partly just to make a separation from my YA novels, because this is The Midnight Club is an adult novel. But it is a little, I think the techniques that you use to create fear are a little bit different, because I do have spooky scenes in all my books. And that's like the hardest thing, is how do you pace a scene to make it scary?
My my longer works are all third person. I think I have some short stories that are third person, but I don't love reading first person, so I don't like writing it.
Could you articulate why that is? Just the same reason you don't like strawberry milkshakes or whatever.
Maybe the same reason.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think that first person present tense feels like a cheat. Because then there's a lot of more wiggle room that you have in a way that I don't care for. I think it's just a preference thing.
And Margot, I just am so interested in the actual details of pounding on the keys. What tricks do you feel are available to you aside from unreliable narrators in first person that are not available, or vice versa? You know what I mean?
Well, I have written a lot of first person present tense just because it's very common in YA. Again, many readers do not like
everywhere
it.
in YA, right? Yeah.
But I think teenage readers tend to like it more.
Yeah.
Maybe because it kind of reminds people of online discourse, like blogging or something, or social media. And maybe it is a little bit of a cheat, but it gives you so much immediacy in those scary scenes. Because it's I hear a sound, what is it? And it's you're right there with the character. But you still have to pay a lot of attention to how to pace the scene correctly. For me, the only thing that works is, revising over and over because I never get the pacing right on the first try. I mean, pacing is so important in horror. I think it's easier to see in movies. Like in movies, I can say, if there's been a silence this long, I know there's going to be a jump scare. But because movies are in time, you can time things. Reading is different. Everybody reads at their own pace. So it's really hard to set that up, and I think only trial and error works for me.
I love the first person, and I think it comes back to what you were saying about interiority, and especially with first person past tense, it allows you to, I'm thinking of one of the kind of great postmodern novels, The Name of the Rose, which is presented as a found document, and the header at the top of it is a manuscript, naturally, which I think those are the kinds of stories I'm drawn to because what you have is the account of some person experiencing the events. But by presenting it as a found document, it places it into a context that then you, as the reader, can try to unpick. And it allows, I think it allows for more subtlety when presenting an unreliable narrator because you can use that implicit context to contradict what's happening in the text in ways that I find pleasing. And I think, as I was saying before, if so much of what affects me as a horror writer are those things that remain unexplained, the more context that's built around that gap, the more effective it's going to be as a reader. So I find first person past is probably what I'm most drawn to as a reader because it allows me as a reader to kind of become the historian. Okay, so they're presenting the manuscript in this context. How can we look at it? How can we analyze it in that way? And I think there's a lot of crime fiction that kind of adopts this perspective. And so many, for me as a reader, those are some of the most unsettling books I've ever read. Kind of crime fiction with a reliable narrator, because you have, shocking violence like you would find in a horror novel, in the context of so many unanswered questions, and the reader is often left unable to put together any meaning, to make sense of what happened in the story in any meaningful way. They're left with contradictions, and I think for me, maybe that's my experience looking at the world today. Oftentimes, is aghast at what's happening and unable to make any meaning of it. And so when I encounter that in a fictional setting, it can be comforting in a way.
It seems like a lot of what we've been saying is, the sense of the unknown and the unknowable is frightening, and then you're talking about gaps. And on the point of view question, if you're writing in third, you have the gap between the narrative perspective and the character's perspective, and it seems as though there's room in that gap for something horrific to lurk. And if you're writing in first, you have the temporal gap between the time at which the story is being told and the time at which it's unfolding, and it seems as though there's also room in that temporal lacuna for something fucking horrible to be. Because you can see the character is changed, the narrative voice can be changed from the speaking voice of the character in dialogue, and what accounts for that change. Yeah. Well, no, this is exciting. I feel like I'm learning a ton. I'm like learning in real time.
Do you write in limited third, or?
So first 3 books, third person limited with multiple POVs. Fourth book, first person, which I had no idea how to do and thought it would be easy, and it was not. In large part because of that gap. I thought, oh wait, well this story is being told to someone now. Who is it being told to? And it's being told from a place, from a particular context. Well, what is that context? Is the woman telling this, is she 20 years older than the event's happening? Is she 10 years older, 40 years older? And I didn't realize I was gonna have to answer any of those questions until I was like halfway through the book, and it's like, oh, there's more. There's a lot more to this than I was warned. It's always my experience with writing books.
Well, I think we have until 2:45, I believe, so we have a little more time. Something I just want to throw out is I would love, as somebody who reads horror fiction and sometimes struggles to find the right book for me, I would love to just hear some of your recent reading or viewing within the genre and your recommendations. Because the reality is I'm rereading books I read a few years ago because I can't find anything else. So help me out.
One I really liked, a book I really liked recently was William by Mason Coyle, which just came out. And it's about, I would say it's AI horror. It involves a kind of lifelike robot powered by AI, which is sort of a classic uncanny thing, looks human but is not human, but it's handled really well. And it's a short book, you can read it in one sitting. And it definitely got under my skin.
I'm recommending for you Go for Paul Tremblay. It's so good, and I know that you also love the ambiguity. There's been so much good stuff, and I feel like I'm blanking on all of it at the moment. I've enjoyed Chuck Wendig lately, Blackbird for Orchard, but also Wanderers and the sequel Wayward. Those are post-apocalyptic virus stories that hit a little close to home. I'm blanking on all the wonderful things I've read recently.
Well, we both read Incidents Around the House, but
Yes.
I know I liked it more than you did, by Josh Mallerman.
Yeah.
That one's very divisive, but I thought it was pretty scary. And one surprise that I had recently in movies was The First Omen, which I wrote a review for 7 days, but I thought that an Omen prequel would obviously be skippable, but it turns out this one's really terrifying.
I've skipped it, so. The Substance is the horror movie that has most tickled my fancy this year, I think.
Oh yeah, I loved that one.
It's very gross.
Did you read that new George Saunders book of short stories?
I thought.
I was just trying to look up the title on my phone. It's like Liberation Day, I think it is. The first story in that is not horror, but profoundly unsettling and extremely, you really don't know what's happening for the first half of the story, and when you realize what's happening, it still doesn't. That whole book of stories is great. It's not an anthology; it's just his stories.
The book that I've probably been most, within our genre, that I've been most affected by the last few years is a book called The Apparition Phase by Will McLean. And it was published by Penguin in the UK. I don't know if it was ever given an American release. It's readily available, and you can get it electronically. But it's a first-person narrative story starting in childhood. So all the things that scare me, and it's takes place in England in the 70s, and it's just our narrator is describing it starts with he and his twin sister, their shared obsession that they have with spirit photography, which of course is something that I'm also very interested in. So of course I'm in this book, and they decide they're going to fake a spirit photograph, and they do it, but there are unexpected consequences that play out over maybe 15 years, and it's one of those books where, like, yes, on one hand, it was sort of feels tailor-made for me, given what I'm interested in and what I was like when I was a child, but incredibly unsettling. And one of those books where I read it around the time it came out, and I've been rereading it and realized that I still remember all of the major set-piece scenes, which is pretty uncommon for me, especially these days with small children at home. So I'll put that forward as my recommendation. And I think, now that we've got 10 minutes, I'd be happy to throw open the questions if anybody in the audience has anything we can weigh in on. Yeah, go ahead.
The world is trash. How are you relying more on your brains for the scary things and really pushing yourself, or are you finding that you're having to heavily edit, just in terms of your readership and your fans? Are you finding that it's coming really easily to you? And I wanted to know more about that, just in terms of how much are you pushing yourself to get the really scary stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I am a fairly fast writer and write pretty regularly, and it goes in ups and downs, and I think that sometimes the world gets a little too much to be creative and to put pressure on myself to be creative. Sometimes it just sort of flows. So it ebbs and flows, and for me, I can flow consistently enough that I don't have to be hard on myself when I'm not producing. But it's always a little disconcerting. My idea's gone. Probably not.
Yeah, I really compartmentalize in terms of the horror of the world, but I do have a doom scrolling habit that I need to do something about. I've been doom scrolling on Threads, and it's almost as bad as Twitter, really. So I need to avoid that. That just takes up time. I think I still have mental space to think of scary things, but I need more time.
That's the question. How do you write when the world's burning
how
down?
are you pushing yourself when people are so exposed and just have access to all of this stuff? And how are you finding that your readers are still paying attention, and you're finding that you're really having to really sort of in your brain and push yourself because people are so desensitized?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd be super curious. Whenever somebody sends me an email, I'm like, how did you discover these books? And it's all over the map, really. And so I've sort of given up on trying to figure out where my readership is coming from, because it's sort of unknowable. Some are people on deployment, and they're like, yeah, like the guy 2 bunks down from me told me to read this book. And some people are like, well, I was in the hospital with some chronic illness, and I needed books to read. It's all over, so I just kind of do the best job and hope that people find their way there.
I think I do much the same as you, Margot, in terms of compartmentalizing. And for me, a lot of what I do these days is nonfiction writing and nonfiction research. And, especially when you're looking at things that happened, 90, 100 years ago, it can be a world into which you can escape. Not that things were, not that they had it figured out in the 1930s, believe it or not, but it's different enough and so involving that it allows me to kind of, it can be a nice escape into a different world. Not that it's a better world, but it's at least a different one.
I'm just going to offer a quick consumer alert here that we've been hearing about we've been hearing about the movie, the Terrifier movies, and which I've only seen the first one so far. But there is a completely separate horror movie from Argentina called Terrified. Not Terrifier, but Terrified, which is a really kind of brilliant, seriously intended movie that is still, full out horror. And I'm saying this because actually Paul Tremblay said that he had recommended Terrified to someone and they went out and watched Terrifier. And we're getting him brief about this. What do you mean this is a great movie? No, it's one movie. So there's Terrifier and there's Terrified.
Is Terrified streaming?
Yeah, it's on Amazon. And the same guy did it as an evil Where evil lurks. That horror writers I know are, have you seen that?
Yeah.
I mean, the horror writers I know are just aghast at how unnerving it is. So Brian, maybe not.
I'll sit that one out.
I have a couple recommendations. You guys know Gretchen Felker Martin. She wrote a couple recent novels. She would like to get into the gross things, the character of an author. She wrote about zombie plague with cannibals, all the men are cannibals. Great. And now she's written cuckoo about a conversion camp where horrible things are happening. The other one I would like to recommend, same publisher, queer author, is Chuck Tingle. You guys know Chuck Tingle? Yeah. That kind of, I'm kind of fascinated by this wholesomeness, but he's also, because he also writes about existential dread, and he's now in the traditionally published or he's not traditionally published form. So, wow. Anyway, those two, same publisher actually, for Fire. Anyway, I wanted to ask you three, everyone up here, what ideas are they trying to get at? Are you trying to get at with your work? Like, what are you trying to like get into? Like, how to describe it, whatever it is.
I don't really deal with ideas very well. I feel like I get waylaid when I try and follow an idea. I just try to write characters and try to get deep into character, and then put those characters in conflict with each other and see what happens.
Okay, yeah. I will overlong perhaps some kind of more existential notions of despair, meaning using the ghost story or horror fiction as a vehicle to work out how can we make meaning in the world, or how do we reconcile ourselves to what's happening in this world.
Yeah, well, with this book, The Midnight Club, I definitely got into some ideas. I mean, it's really about how we reconcile ourselves to our past and how we stop dwelling on the past, because the characters are taking a drug that allows them to relive their past in vivid detail and sort of bring back, kind of revive the spirit of someone in their lives who died, in a sense. She's not really a ghost, but there is a Ouija board scene. So that's an idea that I've been obsessed with. Like, what is the role of memory in our lives? Is it holding us back, or is the truth in our memory, and we just have to find it? I'm fascinated by like Proust talking about voluntary versus involuntary memory and stuff like that. So this was a book that took a long time to get out there, finally.
I like feminism and I like monsters, and those are two things that are in most of my books, and how they interplay is different from book to book. But generally those are the two things that I like to include.
Still got 5 more minutes if there's one. Go ahead.
I think horror is very visual, right? There's a scene, there's a jump scare, there's gore. But that's kind of in movies. How do you like transfer that into the written work? Right? Do you feel that you're still trying for that visual imagery? Are you trying to like draw the reader into suspense? Like, what is your plan?
in the written word, you can get deeper into somebody's head, into their perspective, into what they're feeling, because the movies can only show you what's happening, but with a book, you can be riding along with somebody in their mind as they're experiencing pain, disgust, terror, all of those fun sensations.
Yeah, I think you can still do a jump scare, but it's all about pacing. Like, a jump scare is basically just something horrifying suddenly appearing, suddenly intruding into someone's life. So I think it's partly about like leading up to that really carefully, like, oh, I sense something a little wrong, I hear a noise, I look around the corner, and then boom, something comes up behind me. But one of the tricky things is that you don't want to get too literary in those scenes. Like, you don't want to have a long, detailed description because it's going to detract from the horror, I think. Like, even a really literary author like Shirley Jackson, I think, understands that. Like, she understands how to make things scary.
Well, that's a very funny segue, because I was about to say something completely different, which is just that I think that the linguistic disintegration can mirror a kind of psychological disintegration, and that's a tool available to you as a writer that's not available to a filmmaker. Like, I think of the scene in Dante's Paradiso where he finally has the divine vision, and the line is, trasuminar significar per verba non si poria. And he needs to switch. The language breaks down from Italian into Latin, per verbas in Latin, because it's like, it's crumbling. His Italian is crumbling under the weight of describing the divine vision. And I think the inverse of that is possible when describing horror, and you can have all kinds of tricks at your disposal linguistically to have a kind of crumbling or a weight or buckling. But maybe you would disagree, Margot, and say that's just slowing shit down. And maybe I don't write horror, so maybe.
No, I do agree with that. I think that, it's just, it's in how you, when I say that you shouldn't be too literary, I think I mean you shouldn't be too eloquent. Mm-hmm. Like, you shouldn't have a Cormac McCarthy paragraph right there, maybe. But the breakdown of language can be really scary. Yeah. I mean, that's like what Daniel was talking about with framed narratives, or like a found narrative. If it suddenly fragments, that can be very scary.
I think we're just about at our time, but I will take this opportunity to recommend to anyone who hasn't read Arthur Macken's short story White People, which is something that could not work as a film. It's presented as a found document. I find it terrifying and haunting and beautiful, and it couldn't be it could only exist in this form. But I think we're at time, so I want to thank you all again for coming. Thank you all, our panelists, for your insights.